is going to look at public opinion polling, a very common way that we come to understand public opinion around us. There are a few things that we need to understand about public opinion, including how it's measured. So how does random sampling occur to get a small sample of Americans in the United States, relatively representative of 320 to 330 million people. So we'll be looking at that. We'll also be talking about something called the margin of error and what this means, as well as how public opinion polling can be quite costly in a lot of ways. So stay tuned. I look forward to talking with you in this particular segment about public opinion measurement related to polling. I want to start by saying that it is impossible to poll the views of 300 million Americans for a public opinion poll. Actually, more like 330 million Americans, roughly, as of this taping. So because you can't poll 300 million Americans, public opinion pollsters have to come up with a way to approximate the views of 300 million Americans. So they do this by engaging in a certain set of methods to poll the public, okay? There are a few particular steps that public opinion pollsters do. First, they have to randomly sample individuals from the population of Americans. Okay, so you might be saying, what the heck does that mean? Well, what this means is that random sampling basically ensures that every member of the population of Americans has an equal chance of being included in a public opinion poll. You have to have this particular element in a reputable public opinion poll in order to generalize the findings from a smaller group back to 300 million Americans, okay? So public opinion polls randomly sample individuals from a larger population. This ensures, like I said, that every member of the population has an equal chance of being included in the public opinion poll. And this helps with poll representativeness. So if there are 10 members of a population and you want to know how those 10 members of a population think, but only want to poll 3 members of that population, what you would do is drop all 10 names from that population into a hat, shake up the hat, and then draw out 3 names randomly. And those 3 names would be the ones that you would ask questions in a public opinion poll. In that instance, that is what a public opinion poll is trying to do. Take from that smaller sample back to the larger population. So the question then becomes, all right, how many individuals actually have to be polled? It has to be a lot, right? No. Public opinion researchers have found that to approximate the views of roughly 300 million people in the United States, a public opinion poll needs to get to approximately 1,000 individuals. So 1,000 individuals need to give their opinions on something in a poll for those to be reasonably traced back to the views of the population at large. One caveat, though, is that because it is a sample of individuals approximating a larger population, there is some error involved. You cannot perfectly assess the viewpoints of 300 million people from a smaller sample of 1,000 individuals. You can come close, but there will still be a little bit room for error, just as there's a little bit room for error in a lot of things that we do in life. So the goal of public opinion polling is to reduce this error to the smallest value for the best possible price available to pollsters. Polling the public is quite expensive from a monetary perspective. It takes a lot of resources. So what public opinion pollsters have to do is balance the need to accurately represent the views of 300 million Americans, while at the same time ensuring that they're not breaking the bank, figuratively, by putting a poll in the field. This error between what the sample represents and what the larger kind of population of opinions represents is known as the margin of error in a poll. So I'm going to show you the graph on the next slide to give you an idea of what this looks like. So there's a lot going on in this graph, so I'm going to break down a few things for you. This is what the margin of error in a public opinion poll looks like relative to the survey completes, okay? So I want you to look at the axis along the bottom of the screen, okay? So if we think about, for example, this axis, this is the x-axis, okay? The x-axis is giving you the number of completes. This is the number of individuals that participate in a public opinion poll. Remember I told you that the magic number is right around 1,000 individuals, okay? That's at the far end of the scale, okay? So when we think about the number of individuals, 1,000 individuals gets you approximately a margin of error of about 3%. So what this tells you is that you can be relatively confident within 3% of getting a certain percentage of support for a particular candidate, of support for a particular public policy. But the other thing that this graph also shows you is that as you ask for more individuals to take part in your poll, it also becomes much more expensive. So the number of completes here, what you can see, is related to how much a poll costs. The more individuals that take your poll, the more that poll will cost, okay? So the whole point of public opinion polling is to hit 1,000 individuals for a 3% margin of error, and at the same time, get it to a relatively affordable cost for the public opinion polling, okay? So now that you understand this, I want to take you through a couple of the dynamics of what one poll in action would look like. So this was a Republican primary poll from the 2016 Texas Republican primary that was taken by Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts, shortly before the Texas primary on March 1st, 2016. So there are a couple of things that I just want to point out to you about this poll. First is that reputable public opinion polls, they randomly sample individuals from some population to ensure that all members of the population have an equal chance of being selected. I've already mentioned that, but I reiterate it as a point of importance for thinking about how public opinion polling is conducted. The other thing is that this poll contains a margin of error, the range in which the true value exists in the population. So if we think of the population as 300 million Americans, the true value is if you could talk to every one of those 300 million Americans, what would be the true value of support for these particular candidates? Or in this particular instance, it's if you could talk to all Texans eligible to vote in the presidential primary and you ask them all which candidates they support in the primary, that would be the true value. As I've said, for resource constraints, time, and money, that's not possible for pollsters to do. So they have to approximate that with a smaller sample, that approximately 1,000 individuals in a population, to get a margin of error of about 3%. So the range in which the true value of the population is, in this particular poll, the margin of error is 4.6%. It's the range of any poll value here. Could be 4.6% more or 4.6% less. So really the range is 9.2% where it could fall. The reason why this particular poll has a higher public opinion, look closely. The number of likely voters polled is 446, roughly, right around there. So that is smaller than 1,000. Okay, but if you look at the previous graph that I showed you, you can see that roughly 400 individuals in a poll gives you this margin of error. So the sample size is smaller than what we've talked about. It's 440 roughly. And what this does is this increases the margin of error. But the positive for this particular pollster is that it's less costly, that it costs less to poll 440 individuals as opposed to 1,000 individuals, okay? So in this particular instance, what you can see here is that any one of these particular values, so for example, the first person top left is Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who was in the Republican primary election in 2016. His support going into that particular primary was gauged at 29%. What this poll is telling you, though, is that while 29% is what this particular poll found, with the margin of error, remember the margin of error is 4.6%. Ted Cruz's support could be 4.6% above 29% or 4.6% below 29%. And this becomes an issue in close races. So if you look, the second candidate in the middle on the top row is businessman Donald Trump. His support is pegged in the poll at 28%. So what that means is that technically there's an overlap between where their true support could lie. So when a pollster or when someone in the news says that polling results are within the margin of error, this is what they're talking about. So what should you be assessing with a public opinion poll? Well, there are a couple of things. First, you want to look at the sample size. An N of 1,000 gives you a margin of error, in this case MOE for abbreviation, at about 3%. You also want to look at the poll sponsor. You want to be careful with interest group polls. Interest groups, for example, as we've talked about, like the National Rifle Association, the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence, they have agendas, which oftentimes means that they might ask questions that encourage certain answers in a public opinion poll. A poll is only as good as the questions that are asked by the pollster and the answer options that are given to a respondent. So interest groups oftentimes try to game public opinion polls by trying to show support for particular policies so that they can then get more money from donors and get more support from members of Congress. You also want to look at who is included in the poll. Is the population clearly identified and is the sample clearly identified? So the breakdown of men and women, the breakdown of minority and ethnic groups, the breakdown by age and education. These will be very important. As we've talked about throughout this section of the course, these types of factors are important for the attitudes that we hold. So it makes sense that these particular individuals and these particular different groups, age and gender and race and ethnicity, have to be well represented in a poll for the opinions in the poll to then be representative to a larger population. You also want to look at how the sample is selected. Random selection versus self-selection versus a convenience sample. We've talked about the fact that random selection of individuals from a population is the best method of approximating a larger population. However, I will also say that self-selection and convenience samples are not as good for gauging public opinion because those are based on the individuals that are showing up to express an opinion. And we know who those people are. Maybe they might be sitting around the table at the next family dinner or the next holiday dinner. They're the ones who might be a little bit angry at what the president's doing or a little bit angry about what Congress is doing and are much more likely to express their opinions because of that anger. This is why self-selection and convenience samples with polling or with gauging public opinion can be problematic. You also want to look at how the results are framed. So how are the results reported? Are they accurately depicting the spread of individuals supporting a particular candidate? So in the previous public opinion poll that I showed you from Emerson College, the accurate way to reflect those results would be that the Texas primary was too close to call, that the results were within the margin of error, not that Ted Cruz leads Donald Trump by 1 point, because again, that's within the poll's margin of error. So that's two different ways of framing the results. One way says Ted Cruz is winning. The other way says the contest is too close to call. Two very different ways of framing the results. Finally, you also want to look at the questions included in a poll. Look for the balance of questions that are asked. You want to look at the response options. You want to get an idea of how the order of questions are put in a poll. We know, for example, that public opinion scholars have found that the way questions are ordered ultimately influences how individuals respond to later questions. It's what's known as priming. We are primed to think about particular stimuli in a different way because of the information that we've received before that. So these are all very important things to think about when assessing public opinion polls. I've included a link here to the Gallup organization, one of the oldest polling organizations in the United States, for you to peruse their website and get an idea of what some of the public opinion polls they look at. So this is Gallup's website. Gallup, as I just noted to you, is one of the oldest public opinion organizations in the United States, and they poll the public on a number of issues. So if you scroll down right now, there's a lot of polling information about election 2016, about the presidential election, and you will see here some public opinion measures in terms of thinking about, for example, favorable versus unfavorable views of the presidential candidates, fear of the greater of two evils in terms of the candidates, favorability among particular age groups. Remember, we've talked about the fact that public opinion polls should have an accurate representation of members of the population by age, by race and ethnicity, and by gender. And what you can see here is information about these things. So I encourage you to take a look around the website, look at some of the topics that are covered in terms of public opinion polls. Again, these types of examples are great for those exam essay questions that you might see on the AP Government and Politics exam. Now that you've looked at a couple of examples from the Gallup organization in terms of what public opinion polls look like, I want to move on to talk about other forms of opinion that you might see as you, for example, surf the internet, talk on Facebook with friends, or look at your Snapchat feed.